Okay, so we're up to Genesis chapter 3, the bad guys. But I want to clarify a couple of things because, as you pointed out, how come I've never heard this before? Right? How come I've never read the Genesis account like this? And there are good reasons for that, not least of which is the church has been, at the academic level, principally dominated by males who have a vested interest in making sure that, females stay in their place. But the real problem behind all this is what happened in the Catholic Church 1,000 years ago or before that with mistranslations of Scripture. And we're going to see a few of those as we go along. And typically what happens in a translation community is that very few people actually go back and start all over again. What they do is they use translations that they already have to direct how they will, even though they say an original translation from the text, what they're really doing is using the history of the translation already in place so that they can continue with the same kind of pattern and obviously make some changes and corrections, which they've done a lot after the Dead Sea Scrolls. But in general, the translation patterns follow the same kind of contours year after year, right? There's also obviously another reason. Why do we need 50 translations of the Bible? There's only one original text, right? And the problem is that the Masoretic text is thousands of years after it was written to start with. That's why the Dead Sea Scrolls are so important. And the second is the Bible is the most purchased book in the world. So if everybody has a King James Version and there's only one version out there, then I can't sell any more. So I have to have new versions so I can make more sales. I mean, it really comes down to that. It's an economic decision, right? I need more translations so that you'll buy more Bibles and stick them on your shelves and think that you know what the Bible says, okay? So all kinds of craziness going on there. Don't ask me, what do you think is the most accurate translation of the Bible? Don't, please. Here's the problem. If we pick some translations, I could show you where each translation has its own particular bias and sometimes either adds or takes away from the actual text in order to facilitate the theological bias. So here's the best way to handle this. First, you know that when you're reading a translation, if it's a decent translation at all, if the scholar who does the translating adds to or takes away from the text, it ought to be in italics. So when you're reading along and you see a word in italics, that means, oh my gosh, the word wasn't in the text and somebody had to add it in order to smooth out the English translation. And they do that for legitimate reasons because Hebrew doesn't read like Greek or Hebrew doesn't read like Indo-European languages, right? Hebrew is really weird. In other words, it isn't good English, okay? Because in Hebrew is a language without punctuation. You already know it doesn't have any vowels, but it doesn't have any punctuation either, right? So how do I get emphasis in Hebrew? I take the word that I want to have emphasis on, put it first in the sentence. It doesn't matter if it's an adjective, a preposition, a noun, a direct object, a verb. It makes no difference. I just put it first, right? So try to translate it literally. And the syntax of the sentence is all messed up. It reads like, some primary student trying to write a sentence and getting all the words in the wrong order, okay? So when I translate into English, I have to rearrange the words. And when I rearrange the words, I often change the relationship between the words simply to get them into proper English grammar, right? Things that would happen for a native Hebrew speaker would see that, but the English translation just obliterates it. And it's not because they're being nefarious. It's because to translate a Semitic language into, where's my Arab guy? Oh yeah, right? It's like translating Arabic into English. Stuff gets left on the table. And there's no way you can prevent it because the languages don't work the same way, okay? And by the way, we're going to see some of that where there's some very critical verses where the rearrangement of syllables makes a huge difference. And by the way, your version of Genesis chapter 3 is based on a particular way that the symbols are arranged, okay? So we're going to see that in a second. But look how difficult that is. So when you come to me and say, what's the best English translation? Immediately I have all these flags going up because of that problem. That isn't all. If that were it, then it would be bad enough. You just have to read, language in all these weird ways. But that isn't all. The problem with Hebrew is that it's a consonant-based language, which means that you can only read it if you already know what it says. Okay? Did you get that? If I strip all the vowels out of a language, I have to know what the word actually says before I can read it, because I have to put the vowels in. Right? Okay?
That's why you can't pronounce, the name of...
Yeah, that's why you can't pronounce Yod He Vah He, because nobody knows where the vowels are. Right? Okay? I can add the vowels and change the word, that's fine. And often in rabbinic commentary, they would say, don't read the word like this, read it like this, and they put a different set of vowels in. And the word becomes something else. Because if it's a consonant-only language, I can't read it until I already know it. Isn't that amazing? In other words, the language has to be communicated to me orally by somebody who can read it so that I know how to read it, because there's no clues in the text. It's just a long string of consonants. I don't even know where the words are because there's no spaces between them. Yeah, right? It's the same thing in Greek, by the way. The original Greek manuscripts are one long string of capital letters with no breaks. Because that's how they wrote. Why would they do that? If I took an English... Okay, of course, because it's not paper, it's papyrus, and it's very expensive, right? But that's not all. If I wrote down an English sentence and took all the vowels out, you could read it, because you know what the words are, right? If I'm writing for people who already know the language, I don't have to put the vowels in, and I don't have to put breaks between the words, because you already know it, right? I mean, think about it. Write down a sentence and take the vowels out. You can still read it because you are a native English speaker and you know what the word should be. So you add the vowels back in, the spaces back in, right? These guys who are writing this stuff aren't writing for you, right? You got it? The Bible isn't written for you. It's written for an audience in the ancient world who already understood the language. Yes, that's right. So that means that the language they're writing in has words in it that mean something in that culture, not in your culture. And I'll give you a good example from the Genesis text. Noah comes off the ark, right? He sacrificed. By the way, how did Noah know that he needed 7 pairs of clean animals and only 2 pairs of unclean animals? How did he know that? The part of the culture is that there's implicit in the text all this cultural stuff. So he comes off. He makes a sacrifice. And there's a word in there, food, right? What does food mean in the Genesis text written to by who's the audience of the Genesis text? Who's the intended audience of the Genesis text? Hebrews when? Are the stories written for Hebrews before Moses, or are they written for are the stories written for people after they come out of Egypt? Yeah. Right? In other words, and you know how you know that? Exodus 20. Is it okay we do some rabbit trails? Right? Okay. Yeah, my time is my own. Okay. This is great. This is the Oxford way, right? In Oxford, the professors published what they wanted to talk about, and if you wanted to hear it, you went to there were no formal classes or anything. You just go and hear So here's the Oxford way. How do I know that the documents from the Mosaic Torah portion, the Pentateuch, were written for the audience that came out of Egypt as ex-slaves? How do I know that? Well, here's one of the clues. Exodus 20. Exodus 20 is the 10 Commandments, right? What is the longest of the 10 Commandments? Which commandment takes the most amount of words to explain? What? Nope. Do you know that do not lie, do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not, all is in one sentence. It's just lo this, lo this, lo this, lo this. It's 10 words and covered all. We make verses out of it, but it's all in one sentence. Which is the one that takes the most explanation? Wait a minute, who said Sabbath? Sabbath. Why does it take a whole bunch of verses and a lot of explanation to tell the people how to meet the commandment of the Sabbath. Why?
They've been in captivity for
Because they've been slaves for 400 years and they haven't kept the Sabbath. They don't need to be, nobody needs to explain to them what adultery is or what killing is or what lying is, because that's part of,
all those 400 years.
right? But for all those years, they've been slaves. So they've never kept the Sabbath. That nobody in their own living memory kept the Sabbath. So God has to say, I want you to honor the Sabbath. And this is what it means. And he goes through what happens to the animals and what happens to the slaves and what work is and on and on and on, right? Why? Because he's instructing an audience that came out of Egypt. There's a big clue in the text that the intended audience are the people who come out of Egypt, right? So, if these stories are written for that audience, then you can understand the command that says, here's the prime directive. Be fruitful and multiply, right? What else? Fill the earth and what? Subdue it. But that doesn't make any sense at all to Adam. Adam doesn't have to subdue anything. For heaven's sake, God makes it. But does God make Adam in the garden or outside the garden? Outside. Outside the garden. And it says, and God placed the man in the garden, right? So here, God makes man from the dust outside the garden. He takes him and he puts him in the garden, okay? What does Gan Eden mean? First, where's the ancient parallel for Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden? Do you know what it means? It means the Garden of Delight. What is the parallel in the ancient world? Where did the idea come from? Yeah, it comes from Egypt, Mesopotamia, right? And how do I know that? Because in ancient documents, the kings built walled gardens where they put the plants that they wanted and the animals that they wanted in those gardens so that they could enjoy the benefits of their royalty, right? So Gan Eden is a replication of that kind of idea, which the people would have been familiar with because they came out of Egypt, of this idyllic walled space. And God puts the man in there. Is there anything in there that needs to be subdued? No. So the commandment doesn't make any sense to Adam at all, because even in the Genesis account, everything in that garden is good. Very good, right? The only way it makes sense is for an audience that knows what work and subduing is all about. In fact, even the commandment, in the day of it that you eat of it, you shall surely die, doesn't make any sense to Adam at all. He's never had any experience of death, but the children that came out of Egypt certainly did. They know what that commandment is about, right? So now I want you to rethink the Genesis account and pretend, for once in your life, that the stories aren't about the actors. The stories are written for people who are well past all that, to give them a history, an identity, a purpose, all that kind of stuff. In other words, they're a tribal account of what I need to know in order to establish a new tribe, a new nation, which is exactly what God says he's going to do. I'm going to take you out of Egypt. I'm going to be your sovereign, your new God, right? And in that process, I'm going to give you an identity. Who are you? You are the one made in God's image, right? And I'm going to give you a new purpose. You're going to be a royal priesthood, a holy nation. And you're going to have a new objective, to be intercessors between God and the rest of the world. And all that stuff is happening in the Exodus account, right? And the stories are the history that I need in order to show that my tribe has identity, right? It's awesome stuff. Yeah, yes. And why would they do that? Because these people came out of Egypt, and they, for hundreds of years, have been influenced by the Egyptian idea of creation, by the Egyptian mythology. And God wants to remove that Egyptian thinking from them, which is what the 40 years in the wilderness is all about, right? Is he successful? No. He can't ever get the slave out of them. And so he has to start over again with another generation. Now that really helps you. I know we're going down the rabbit trail, but this is cool. That helps you understand the Genesis account in its context, right? So think about this. The Genesis account basically says, in our translation, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, right? It's basically what it says. But we have added to that the idea that God created from nothing, that ex nihilo idea, which doesn't show up until Isaiah. because Bereshit doesn't mean in the beginning. There's no definite article. Bereshit means when. When created. And so that means when created, think of verse 2, when created the heavens and the earth. By the way, heavens is plural. Isn't that interesting? Hashemayim. Heavens is a plural noun in Hebrew. That means there's more than one. Okay? Interesting, huh? Egyptian idea as well. What? When created the heavens and the earth was tohu vavohu, formless and void. Okay? Now, if you're an Egyptian, the one thing you absolutely fear is primal chaos, because in Egyptian mythology, the world floats on a sea of primal chaos, and everything I do is to hold back the chaos so that I can survive. So tohu vavohu is a very scary Egyptian concept. And what it says in 1:2 is that God hovers over the face of the deep. The one thing that I'm most afraid of is the face of the deep overcoming me. And it says God hovers over the face of the deep. And what does he bring about? Order. He sets the boundaries for the sea. He sets the realm for the fish of the sea. He sets the realm for the animals. He creates order by his word. And when he does that, he establishes a safe environment for me, something I never had in Egypt. He's rewriting my cosmological history so that I have a different view of the world, right? Awesome stuff. Just because they're slaves, does that mean that they're not educated? It might in our world, but in the Hebrew world, education, that is, understanding who God is and how to worship him, was fundamental to who they were, right? So there is education going on. You know what the primer is for educating Jewish children in ancient times? You know what the primer is that they used? Leviticus. Why? I mean, how many of you read through Leviticus and thought, wow, this is such a great way to teach my children how to read. I should start with Leviticus, right? Why do they start with Leviticus? What's Leviticus about? No, Leviticus is about how to worship God and be ritually clean before him. And so the idea is, if my child learns nothing else, like Dick and Jane, he will know how to worship and be ritually clean before God. The most fundamental thing I can teach my children. And it's in Leviticus, right? I mean, the cultural stuff is so important to understanding how the text works. Okay? Enough of a rabbit trail. Let's go here, because this is filled with cultural stuff, right? This idea of the serpent is filled with cultural images from Egypt. Okay? So, I'm going to have to do it this way. So, who are the actors? Tell me who the actors are in the story. Okay? Wait a minute. The story starts in Genesis. The story starts from our perspective. In our Bible, it starts in chapter 3. But where does the story actually start? Okay? Where does the story actually start? And you won't know that unless you're looking at the Hebrew text and you realize that a word at the end of chapter 2 is the same word. By the way, I did look at the Hebrew text, and you're right. Ezer kenegdo is in 2:20 as well. It's the only story where it's used. Okay? So, right. Okay. Now I've been intimidated enough without the clock. Okay. Oh, thanks. Okay. Here's the really cool thing. Remember that the chapters were added about 1500 and something, or 1400, and the verses were added even 100 years after that. So the divisions in the Bible are completely arbitrary, right? What we have is a continuous story. And the reason we know we have a continuous story is because Hebrew deliberately uses one word and then in another verse the same word to get the continuity to go. Okay? So that at the end of chapter 2, there's a word that's used in the first verse of what we call chapter 3. Okay? The verse in chapter 3, the word in chapter 3 is arum, and it's translated crafty. But at the end of chapter 2, the same word with a different vowel, aram, is translated naked. You would never know that in English, but in Hebrew it's the same word with just a different vowel, right? Why? Why is that important? because the story in Genesis 3 is not about clothes. It's about vulnerability. In other words, it's the naked serpent. The serpent presents one agenda to the couple, but he has a secret agenda inside. He is no longer naked. He looks naked, but inside he's got something else going on, right? At the end of chapter 2, it says, they were naked and not ashamed. And what it's really saying is, it doesn't say, oh my gosh, she needed a bikini. What it means is that you could see through them. They were vulnerable, completely transparent, open to each other, right? Which is the design plan. The design plan is that your marriage should be the safest place in your life. Okay? Yeah, ding. Listen.
Sorry, that was just...
That's right. It was great, wasn't it? Okay? Listen. If Christian marriages were the safest place in the world, we would have no problem attracting the rest of the world to us. Right? Because that's what people want. They want a place where they're safe. They're desperate to have a place where they're safe. And if you don't feel safe in your marriage, none of the rest of your life can feel safe. You're going to be always constantly looking for a safe place because God designed it so that the two of you are transparent. Right? That there's nothing that she knows that you wouldn't gladly let her know about you, and vice versa. Right? That's the whole idea. Naked and not ashamed does not mean no clothes. That's the Sunday school version. Right? The real version is they were completely transparent to each other. Now along comes the crafty serpent. And the serpent looks like he's transparent, but he's not. And that's why the same word is used, because it wants you to recognize that what's happening in Genesis chapter 3 is about transparency, not about nakedness. Okay? So, who are the actors? The serpent, the woman, who else? Adam. Who is missing? Thank you very much. The most important and critical event in all of human history, and God's absent. Right? What happened? He was on vacation? I mean, come on. Why is...
Front of the fruit, right?
Yeah, why wasn't he there saying with the throw a few flaming swords in there. Don't do it, right? Okay? I'm going to suggest to you, just hold your breath. Don't meditate too much on this. I'm going to suggest to you that there's nothing in the garden that God doesn't want in the garden, and that isn't necessary for the garden story. That means the serpent didn't sneak in the back gate when God wasn't looking. God put the serpent there for a purpose, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is absolutely essential to becoming human. Okay? So now we're going to, yeah, it's tough, isn't it? Okay, so now we're going to walk our way through this. We know who the actors are, okay? So the first thing we realize is about transparency, and now we're going to look at this story and see how transparency fits into it. Okay, so how does the conversation start? First, who does the serpent address? Why? Why doesn't he talk to the man? Isn't the man the prophet, priest, and king in his home? Why doesn't the serpent go to the woman? Because she's the ezer, kenegdo. She's the relationship manager. She's the red light, green light in life. If he can convince her, the man will see a big green light and go right along. The man is the puppy dog who follows what the master says, right? You got that? Okay, right? So the serpent knows that if he can convince the woman, he won't have any problems with the man. Okay? So the serpent opens the conversation with the woman. We got to understand that ezer kenegdo is the relationship manager. Okay? Serpent opens the conversation with the woman. What does he say? Yeah, okay, now we're going to stop and rewrite the translation. Because you know that commas, question marks, quotation marks, periods were all added by the translator, right? So the sentence says, Elohim Amar. Right? The serpent says, Elohim Amar. What does the serpent say? God said. He doesn't say, did God say? In fact, you know something? This is amazing. In biblical Hebrew, there is no expression for doubt. Did you get that? There's no word that means doubt. Right? By the way, there's also no word that means certainty. Those ideas show up in the rabbinic period, and they get added in. They show up in the New Testament, but they get added in because they were the impact of Hellenism during the 400 years before Yeshua, before Jesus, right? In the biblical Hebrew of the Tanakh, there's no word for doubt, and there's no word for certainty, because they don't have a concept of doubt, right? Imagine a world where there is no concept of doubt. It's digital, black or white. There's no in-between where I'm not sure what it is, right? It's what God says or what God doesn't say. There's no oh, did God say that? So when we translate the statement into a question of doubting what God said, we have just imported something from our culture into that statement. Because what really happens is the serpent agrees that this is what God said, right? In other words, the serpent says, God said, right? Now, here's the important thing. This is really important. What does the woman say that God said? Read it very carefully. Okay? Somebody read that sentence. The woman responds to the serpent and she says, yes, this is what God said. What does she say? Ta-da! How in the world could she come up with nor touch it when you and I both know that God didn't say that? The serpent, by the way, allows her to say that because she believes that that's what the commandment is. Okay? What? Yeah, and who added it? Nope. Wrong. Yeah. Wait a minute. Adam's responsibility is to communicate to the woman what the commandment from God actually is so that she can manage the relationship based on the actual word of God. And here's what Adam does. I need a victim. Oh, she's pointing to you. Okay, come on. You'll be the victim. It's okay. You're going to play the role of the ezer kenegdo. Okay? So, this is the tree, right? Now, you notice, by the way, that she says in the middle of the garden. But if you look at the rest of the description of the tree, it just says in the midst of the garden. It doesn't say in the middle. So for her, all of a sudden, the tree is the center of her focus. Okay, there's the tree. I'm the serpent. We're standing here talking. Oh, we need an Adam. You'll do. Okay? Here's your role. Say absolutely nothing. Okay? All right. So I'm the serpent. And I come to you and I say, God said. And you fill in the blank for me. You say, yeah, that's right. God said we're not supposed to eat of this tree, and if we eat or touch it, we will die. And I'm the serpent, the crafty, naked snake. And I know that's not what God said, because I know what God said to Adam. So I say, he said, do not eat of the tree. In the day that you eat of it, you will die. But he didn't say not to touch it. You added that because that's what Adam told you. And why would Adam do that? Because he would say to himself this. Reach out your hand. Okay, no, just stay right there and reach out your hand. Good, okay. So he will say this. If I put a fence around the tree so that she can't even touch it, I have no problem with her ever eating it. In order to protect her, I will add to the commandment not to touch it, which means she can't get within arm's length of the thing, right?
If I can't touch it, I can't eat it.
If you can't touch it, you certainly can't eat it, okay? So Adam, for good reasons, Adam adds to the commandment, you can't touch it, because he's trying to protect her from even getting close enough to think about eating it. But the serpent uses the loophole, and here's what he does. God said you can't touch it. Oh my gosh. I didn't die. Oh, I didn't touch it hard enough. I didn't die. I didn't die. God's commandment must not be true. Because I didn't die when I touched it, and you told me that if I touch it, I'm going to die. right? The loophole, the piece that Adam added, the serpent uses to seduce her into thinking that the commandment isn't true. And it's exactly what Paul says. Remember what he said? He says the woman was seduced, but Adam sinned deliberately. Remember that? Okay? Why does he say Adam sinned deliberately? Because Adam is standing right here. In the text in Hebrew, it says that Adam was with her, standing right there in the middle of this conversation. Why doesn't Adam say, oh, gee, dear, God didn't really say that. He just said not to eat it. Why doesn't Adam say that? Well, for one thing, what?
Wanting to be right.
That's right. For one thing, if he admits now that he actually told her something that God didn't say, what's that going to look like for him? And then she's going to say, how many other things did you not, right? You see what's going to happen? He has to admit that he made up something. I mean, he has good reason. He wants to protect you. But that's not the point. The point is he didn't deliver what God said. As a result of that, the serpent can use the leverage to get her to eat from it. So now, thinking that the commandment is not true, she eats from it. What's he going to do? I'm in an impossible situation now, right? If I say, oh no, dear, I'm not going to eat from it because I know God said not to eat from it, then I've already condemned her and removed myself. But if I eat from it, look, I got a choice. It's either God or the woman. And for most men, we know what the choice will amount to. I'd rather have the woman, right? I mean, maybe I can put the deal off with God, but if she's gone, I'm in real trouble. So he eats from it, knowing all along that the commandment that she's responding to isn't the one that God said.
So what you're saying is Adam knew, but the woman didn't know.
That's right.
And so because half of what she believed to be true wasn't true, she took the whole thing to be untrue.
You got it.
Okay.
Now here's the question. Who committed the first sin? That's right. And you know what? The reason that we know that that's true is because the fig leaf belt is really a Babylonian word that comes from a military belt where I display all my medals. So it's not about fig leaves at all. It's about covering myself up with pride. Awesome, huh? That story is really, really interesting because the first thing it says is the woman didn't realize that she was breaking the commandment. She still broke it, but she didn't realize it. He knew that she was breaking the commandment, but he said nothing, right? So the dynamics that's going on between the two of them is incredible. Now I'll give you one more piece of it. There are two words. Remember I told you that there's a word basar, which means two different things. It means flesh and it means proclamation. Guess what? The word zakar means male, but it also means something else. It's used in Psalms for to remember. It's a verb, right? So the description of the male in Hebrew is one who remembers. What's his job? To remember exactly what God says. Nothing more, nothing less. Exactly what God says. Okay? The word for female, nekava, also has another meaning, and it means necklace. It means the fence around the person, the necklace, right? The borderline. So here's the point. He is supposed to communicate to her exactly what God said. His job is to remember it. Her job is to use that information to create the borderline for the two of them. Here's the problem. When he does not communicate that, it causes this seduction of Eve. But let's back up one more step and ask, what was her job in relation to the serpent? You know what she was supposed to do? She was supposed to say, gee, my husband is the one who communicated with God. Why don't you ask him? In other words, she usurped his position by answering the serpent. Right? You should have deferred to the one who was supposed to remember exactly what God said. Right? Do you see the mutual involvement? The one who had first-hand information. Right. Right. You should have said to the serpent, don't talk to me. I heard this from my husband, and I trust his relationship with God so much that I will count on him to remember what God said. Ask him. In which case, Adam could have responded properly. Right? But because she usurped the role that Adam had, believing that she was the complete manager of the relationship instead of the instead of the relationship manager. She just took over. And when she took over, it created the loophole for the serpent. Right?
Gotta run that by me again.
Okay. You are the ezer kenegdo, but you are the ezer kenegdo of him, not of what happens in the outside world that comes to seduce you, right? To trick you. So your job is to make sure that he understands what it is that God wants him to do and to bless him in the process. But here comes the serpent, and instead of talking to him about what God said, he talks to you. And the first thing you should have said is, wait a minute, I rely on my husband to understand what it is that God said. Go talk to him, right? Instead, Hava interferes with that relationship and takes over the role that he should have had, leaving you in silence and creating the probability or the possibility that they would both fail. Right? It's quite complicated, isn't it? But it's so juicy. It's got all this cool stuff going on in it, right? All these things that are happening under the surface. When we just read through the text, it looks like, oh yeah, she just made a mistake. Wrong. Guess what? She was trying to be the ezer kenegdo because her effort was to bless him. But because she had the wrong information and he didn't say anything, the whole thing fell into disaster.
But then you say she should have deferred to her husband.
Right.
What you're saying.
Right. So that she would have the right information from her husband, whose job it was to know what God said, so that she could properly manage how they would respond to it. Right? That's exactly right. But see how important that is? See why it's so critical that the ezer kenegdo know exactly what God has in mind for her. Because it's so easy to take over the role that she's not supposed to play. I'm so glad.
He will rule over you.
Boy, I'm so glad you're in this class because you're just walking right into the things. It's awesome. I couldn't have a better introduction. Okay, right. So now we have to go look at that verse and say, okay, so what's happening in that verse? And the problem is that there's a word in that verse that's only used 4 times in Scripture, and that's the word that Pagnino misinterprets and changes the whole direction of church theology. Okay? So we're going to look at that. Okay? All right. So. Okay, so we're good. So far we're good. Oh, you want to object? Abraham and Sarah is a repetition of this Genesis account. Did you know that? Hagar's the fruit. Sarah says, I can fix the problem. I'll just provide a new little bit of fruit for Abraham. And in fact, Hebrew actually uses the same phrase to tell you that the stories are connected. Why? Because it says of Abraham, and he listened to his wife, which is exactly what it says in the Genesis account. So you're supposed to read the Abraham and Sarah story and remember the Genesis account. That's the whole idea, right? And guess what? The fruit that Abraham eats, which, by the way, what was he supposed to do? His wife comes to him and says, you know, I have this really foxy-looking Egyptian maid. Maybe you should have sex with her so we could have a child. What are you supposed to say? Wow, that's a great idea. I never thought of that.
Well, now that you mention
Wait, yeah. Wait a minute. What are you supposed to say? What are you supposed to say?
I'm glued to you.
Yeah, and I've heard from God, and he says that the child will be ours, right? And she says, yeah, but you know me, I'm not getting pregnant. So, I think you should, try it with somebody else. Awesome, right? But that's not what Abraham says. Abraham says, well, got a green light? He got a green light, so why not, right? It surely wasn't, and Abraham knew that. But he went ahead anyway because he got the green light from Sarah, and Sarah gave him the green light because she didn't understand what God was actually doing. And Abraham was supposed to communicate that in a way that she would also say, I'll be patient enough to wait. Right? It's the same story over again. Okay, so now, go back to Genesis 2:24 and tell me what the role of the man is. 2:24, right? Therefore, man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one. Right? What's the role of the man? The man is the aggressor. The man is the aggressor in order to connect himself to his wife so that he's super glued to her with all the responsibilities that go along with that. What's she supposed to do? Nothing. Wait for him to get glued to her. At which point, her role takes over, and now she becomes the relationship manager of somebody who's super glued to her. Okay? So, your question is, who knows? Your question is, this is Hebrew. It's messy. You don't know how that thing, it isn't like, look, guardian angel is not, as I said right at the beginning, it's not a marriage manual, because you're not going to get step, step, step. If I just do this, then this will happen. If I fix this, if I fix that. No, it's messy. And the story is deliberately messy because you don't know how to separate out those rules. Everything's happening at the same time in this one conversation. All these things are falling apart, and they're not doing what they're supposed to do, but they're not even aware that they're not supposed to be doing some of this stuff, right? It's the human condition. It's how messy it is when you get married and suddenly realize you got to live with somebody, right? It would be so much easier to have an AI model, right? But it doesn't work that way, does it? Right? Okay? By the way, there's a great movie that you can watch about AI. It's called Ex Machina, right? It's about a guy who creates an AI woman. And it's awesome because in the end she kills him. she, that's right. No, but it's, but it's so cool because the whole movie is about determining whether or not she can actually think for herself, whether or not she's actually a sentient being. And the way that she proves it is by killing her creator. It's so filled with all this biblical stuff. It's an awesome movie. Okay. Okay, so do you understand what's happening in the plot so far? Because now we're going to look at the Genesis account after the disobedience, and we see all kinds of other clues happening. Okay, so let's go look. Genesis 3. Sin disrupts the created order by establishing a false hierarchy, right? Now you're going to see how the false hierarchy gets established, right? Then we have to look at the punishment that happens in terms of a Jewish idea of measure for measure, right? You know the lex talionis, right? Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, right? Okay? What that is the Jewish concept that the punishment must fit the crime. And we think how horrible that is, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But what it really is the limit of the punishment. In other words, if I cause you to lose one eye, you're not allowed to take two. I'm sorry, there is no such thing as, emotional damage, right? Okay, you don't get to sue for, all that stuff. In Hebrew, what you did is limited, the punishment is limited by the exact amount of what you did. That's the maximum. What's the minimum? Thank you. That's exactly right. And that's exactly what Yeshua employs in John chapter 8, right? The maximum is set by the measure for measure, but the minimum is forgiveness, right? Now that plays a really important part in what happens in the rest of this chapter. But the idea is measure for measure. So when we come to understand what God is doing in the punishment, where he says, as a result of this, this is going to happen to Adam, and as a result of this, this is going to happen to the woman, we have to think in terms of measure for measure, and I'll show you why in a second. Finally, trying to do what she was meant to do with somebody else who is no longer in her efforts, and we'll see that in Genesis chapter 4. Something happens that shifts the way the relationship works, okay? And we need to ask what is prescriptive and what is descriptive. Because if it's prescriptive, as he's suggesting, that God is causing the man to take over the role so that the woman will now lust after him. Lust is the word that Pagnino uses, and therefore she has to be under control. That's a prescriptive. And a lot of Christian scholars take this verse as prescriptive. But I'm going to suggest to you that it's descriptive, that God is saying this is what's going to happen. I'm not going to make it happen, but as a result of these broken relationships, this is what's going to happen. Okay? So let's see what happens. Okay. Now I'm going to give you a little Hebrew stuff so you can figure this out. Okay. First, we need to go back and understand what happens when God confronts the couple. All right? There's a really great book by Avia Kushner. It's called The Grammar of God. It's well worth your reading. Avia Kushner is a native Israeli who was doing her PhD at one of the American universities and took a class called The Bible as Literature. And she says right at the beginning of her book, when she walked into the class and listened to what they were talking about, she didn't even know what book it was. Because in English, it was so different than what she grew up with as an Orthodox Jew. She couldn't even recognize it as the Bible. Okay? So from that, she starts talking about how Hebrew grammar works. and how different it is from English. And the stories that she has are incredible. And one of them is about this text. And what she says is this. Remember the verse where it says, and they heard the sound of God walking in the garden, and they were afraid and hid. Okay? Let me tell you what's happening in the Hebrew grammar. The first thing that she says is that is not a possible translation at all. Because what's happening in that is the focus on the verb. They heard the walking. They didn't hear God walking. That would be noun-based. They heard the walking. And what that isn't, that's an idiom for the sound was coming from all directions at once. Okay? Why is this important? Because Adam tries to hide. And what he discovers is he hears the sound of God from all directions at the same time. So there's no place to hide. Everywhere he turns, the walking is coming to him. Right? The first thing we recognize is that it is not possible that God can't find these people. Right? They experience a 360-degree surrounding of God's presence. Okay? Got it. And then something really important happens in Hebrew, the construction of Adam's answer to God. Because what does God say? He says, where are you? By the way, there's two words for where in Hebrew. One means geographical location. The other means a surprise that you're not in the place where you're supposed to be. Okay? So God doesn't ask where they are geographically. He asks, how come you're not here? You're supposed to be with me, right? Where are you? And Adam answers. Now, pay really close attention to this. Adam answers. Oh, you probably have it there. Let's read it in the English translation. Do you see where Adam answers God? Stop. Stop right there. Okay? So now we know hearing the voice in the garden isn't about a direction. Hearing the voice in the garden means that Adam is aware that God's presence is totally surrounding him and he can't escape. And then he says, and I what? I heard the voice in the garden and... What does it say? I was afraid. Awesome. Because in Hebrew, there's a tense called the vowel consecutive or conversive. And that tense changes the way a verb works so that the verb isn't in the past tense. It's also not in the future tense. And it's not in the present tense. In other words, it covers all the tenses at once. So what Adam says is, I was, am, will be afraid. Because I was, am, will be naked. Right? In other words, Adam employs the Hebrew idea of time. The Greek idea of time is linear. You have a nice line, right? Here's the Greek idea of time, right? We have a line like this. The past is downstream. The present is where I am now. The future is upstream. Absolutely Greek. That's why the Greek philosophers can say no man can step in the same river twice, because the river's past him, right? But Hebrew doesn't work like that. Hebrew is cycloidal. Remember what a slinky looks like? That's the Hebrew idea of time, that it goes around and changes position every time it goes around. It's like putting the white dot on the edge of a bicycle wheel and then watching it go down the road. The wheel's turning every time, but each time the white dot touches the road, it's in a different place. Okay? So here comes Adam, and he says, in Hebrew time, I was afraid, I am afraid, I will be afraid. In other words, in all the temporal sequences, the same thing applies. Fear. Okay? Then he says, and by the way, he says, I was, am, will be afraid, because what? And you know that it's not about Brooks Brothers. What's it about? What does naked mean in this story? I was, am, will not be transparent. In other words, Adam has experienced a psychological shift in his being. For the first time, he recognizes that he's not transparent, that he's hiding something. And he realizes that that's who he is now. Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, because I sinned. Did you get that? It's not about sin for him. It's about something that happened psychologically to him so that his relationship to the entire world, God and everything else, has now shifted so that he recognizes that something has happened inside of him that's changed everything about the way he relates, right? That from now on, he will remember that he wasn't transparent. He will struggle with transparency, and he will project not being transparent. All that shift in one verb in Hebrew. Okay? So, wait. So God says to him, right? What's God's answer? Oh, you sinned. I'm going to punish you. Is that what God says? No. What does he say? Who told you you were? And we know that that means who told you you were not transparent? Right? What's the answer? Who is Adam? No, nakedness is about transparency. Yeah, or in this case, he's saying, I'm afraid because I'm no longer transparent. And God responds, who told you that? Right? Okay? And here's the question. Wait, here's the question. Who told Adam that he was no longer transparent? Careful. You're exactly right. Adam told Adam he wasn't transparent. It's not the serpent. It's something that's happened inside of Adam himself. He's changed psychologically inside. He recognizes he's different than he was. And guess what? He can never go back. Right? Innocence is gone. It can never be recovered. Right? Something has happened to Adam that's changed everything about him. So ultimately, Adam is afraid of himself. Right? And now you know why I wrote the book Crossing. Because being afraid of yourself is what happens to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, all the way through. It's this internal fear of what happens to me when something happens inside of me. So I'm aware of my own disobedience, of my own lack of transparency, of my own failure. And all that kind of stuff starts working on who I am. So I start projecting it into the future. Because guess what? It's not possible to go back in the garden again. I can't return to innocence. It's over with. Now I got to deal with my memory that I failed and the projection that I will fail. Right? I mean, it's incredibly powerful stuff that's going on here because basically this story is teaching Israel what it means to be a failure and how God is now going to restore that. Yes. Absolutely, except now it becomes fully conscious to him. Before he's responding to, I don't want to admit that I told my wife something that she's acting on that will now interfere. Maybe I'll just pretend that it didn't happen. Exactly. Which is why he tries to cover up with pride. The fig leaves, right? And now God confronts him. And for the first time he has to realize, as David Foreman says, he has taken on the psychological interior of this naked serpent. He's just like the snake. He has an interior and an exterior. Before, it was absolutely through and through the same. Now, he has a hidden agenda. Absolutely. But where did you read that? It's not in the text. Right? And by the way, as you pointed out, there's this messiness about how the roles work. So they are mutually responsible no matter what the temporal order was. Right? They're both messing up on the roles. Okay? So it's not like you can point your finger and say, it's all your fault, which is basically what Adam eventually does. It's all your fault. And by the way, it's your fault, God, because you made her like this. Okay? Doesn't work, does it? Because the roles are so messy, so interlocked, that it's even difficult for us to sort out how this works. All we know is something happened in us. And when it happened, we became aware of the fact that we were no longer vulnerable and transparent. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way, even in 1 Timothy. It will eventually get there, maybe. Okay? But in the book, I address that. In fact, we go through all the Pauline letters, wherever he's talking about this stuff, and say, okay, well, what's happening in the translation? Why does it look like this? Why do we interpret like this? And what's really happening in the text? Okay? But good point. Okay? There'll be a lot of other good points in New Testament stuff. But let's finish this first. Okay? So, where are we? Adam is confronted by God. God says, who told you? Adam reveals that he's actually afraid of himself. Now the measure for measure comes into place. And what does God say? As a result of what's happened, the following is going to occur in your life. He addresses the man first. By the way, there's a very specific word for curse, and that word is only used for the serpent and the earth, not for the man and the woman. Okay? God does not curse them. What he talks about is what the inevitable consequences will be as a result of the relationship change. Okay? And the first thing he says to the man is what? He says, as a result of this, what's going to happen? As a result of this, you still have the prime directive. You're still supposed to go out and restore and bring the rest of the world into the shape of the garden. But now the earth is going to resist you. Thistles and thorns are going to grow up. And you'll have to work by the sweat of your brow all the rest of your life to produce what would have naturally occurred had the garden been able to flourish the way it was intended. Okay? Now I want to suggest to you that this is a measure for measure punishment. Because Adam's source will resist him. What's Adam's source? Adamah, the ground. And now God says, as a result of this broken relationship, the ground, the place that you came from, will resist you. It doesn't mean that your job's changed. It doesn't mean that you aren't still responsible for tending the ground, which is the beginning of chapter 2. It means that it's going to fight back. Okay? Now let's move to the woman. Remember, measure for measure. The source resists you in a measure for measure way. Right? The punishment is where you came from will now resist you. Okay? Now let's move to the woman. Two really difficult verses, and they're right here. The first one is that it says, I will greatly increase your pain in childbearing. Now, if you look at any of the really scholarly commentaries on this text, they will tell you that that's an impossible translation. The best that it could say is, your pain will increase in child rearing, not bearing. In other words, God doesn't plan on making it more difficult for you to have children. He simply points out that because of broken relationships, you're going to have difficulty raising them. What do you know? Have you not experienced the 2-year-old who says no? Right? Okay? But I suggest to you that there's something else happening here, and it comes from Catherine Bushnell, who's a Hebrew scholar about 150 years ago, and she pointed out that, remember I said the punctuation was added thousands of years later? The Masoretes added the punctuation. We use the Masoretic text as our basis for a Hebrew translation of the Bible, right? But that text added the punctuation marks about the 10th century CE in the Common Era, right? The text was written at least 2,000 years before that, okay? So here's what happens. When I add the punctuation marks, I add what's called a shiva, and it goes underneath the Hebrew letter to tell me where the syllables break, okay? And of course, if the syllables break in a different point, I might get a different word, and that's exactly what happens. This is the sentence. I will greatly increase your pain in childbearing, right? This is the sentence without the shiva. And look what happens. You see this? You see this? Harba arbe. That is the same Hebrew word repeated twice to add emphasis. I will greatly increase. It's like saying, you will surely die. And it's just the word die twice. Mut mut. Or when Isaiah says, perfect peace, he just says shalom, shalom. Right? That's the way Hebrew expresses the emphasis. Okay? So here it's harba arbe. You will greatly increase. But that depends on having a syllabication that sees this part of the word as a separate word, right? If I take away the shiva, which is just two little points, like a colon underneath this, I get harba arab. And it changes everything about what the text says. Because that text says, the one who seduced you has caused you great pain. My gosh, is that ever different? Right? In other words, that one little mark changes everything about the way the text reads. And now, look, this is a God who forgives, a God of mercy, a God of compassion. Do you really think he's going to punish a woman by making childbearing the worst thing that can happen to her? I mean, all the rest of the Hebrew text is when a child's born, what is it? A tragedy or a joy? It's a joy. It's a celebration. It's wonder. It's fabulous, right? So why in this text would we read that God's going to make it miserable for you, right? The point is, we mistranslated it because of the pointing underneath the text, not because of what the text says, but because of the way we broke the words. And Bushnell makes a great argument for this. You can read it in her book, God's Word for Women. Why? I'm sorry? Yes, it's in my book, and the footnote is in there as well. Okay? And her point is that if I read it like this, it makes perfect sense, because what God is saying is, the serpent seduced you. And as a result of that, all kinds of bad things will happen in your life. And the bad thing that's going to happen is your reference to Genesis 3:16. Because the next thing that it says is, you have, Pagnino translated the word is teshuka. Do I have it here? Yeah, Pagnino, 3:16. Pagnino is a monk about 1500 something, and he mistranslates the Hebrew word teshuka. He mistranslates that word as lust. Okay? I mean, it only occurs 4 times in Scripture. So he mistranslates the word, and what happens is the church, which is basically the Roman Catholic Church, controlled by male hierarchy, sees this as the opportunity to prove from Scripture that men need to control women. Because every man knows that women have an insatiable sexual desire for men, and I have to keep it under control.
Oh, yeah,
It's absolutely true. Why do you think they invented chastity belts? I mean, come on, this is the way to control women, right? So the Bible, according to this translation, clearly says that men need to be in charge because women can't control their sexuality, right? And when you think about it, it fits perfectly into the medieval idea, because in the medieval idea, emotion meant out of control. And women are emotional, men are rational, men are cognitive, men are planners, men are doers. Women are the ones who are constantly being in chaos because they can't control their emotions, right? Isn't that right, Lisa? Okay. So, the whole point is, Bushnell goes back and looks at the ancient text and she says, this is a mistranslation of the word. The word actually means turning. So here's what God is saying descriptively. You have turned to your husband. In other words, instead of listening to what I was telling you, you did what you thought was right for your husband without first understanding what I said. You turned to him. And the result is, he will rule over you. I mean, think about it. It's perfect. It's a perfect description of what happens. Here's what happens. As a result of you eating the fruit, you're going to spend the rest of your life toiling. Whose fault is that? Hers, right? So the next time she comes along with, God's been talking to me, and I really feel in my heart that we should be doing this and such, what are you going to say?
I'm not listening to you anymore.
You got it. I listened to you once, and look what happened. I'm not going to listen to you anymore, right? I mean, the whole idea is that God says, look what's going to happen. As a result of her turning to you and trying to do what she thought she was supposed to do, but being misinformed and making a mistake, and now you have to pay the consequence for it, you will now seek to rule over her. In other words, you will usurp the egalitarian view of the two of you equally joined and assert a hierarchy over her. Okay? Now, I'll give you the punchline. No, it's a matching punishment because, remember, what resists Adam in the punishment? The earth. And the earth is where he came from. Okay? So the source resists further relationship. What's the source of the woman? Measure for measure. The source is going to resist her. The source is now going to fight her. Back up. This one? Okay. So the translation that Bushnell argues for, which removes the little points, right, which were added thousands of years later, is that the one who has seduced you caused you pain. Right? Not I will greatly increase your pain, but the one who seduced you caused you pain. And as a result of that, this is what's going to happen. You turn to your husband, and now he's going to say, I'm not going to listen to you anymore. I'm going to assert my authority over you, which is exactly the source of the woman resisting her. Yeah, but I want you to go back and look at the really good Hebrew scholars on that and recognize that the verb can't be translated that way. The only possibility is about rearing, not about labor. Go back and look, check out Victor Hamilton's commentary on Genesis, or Nahum Sarna's commentary, better, in the JPS Torah commentary series, because Sarna is an Orthodox Jew, right? And look how they deal with that text. Right, no, King James is adding to the text how to explain the comment about child rearing, right? Not about childbearing. And so now you've got all this stuff going on that supports a doctrine that women need to be controlled by men because God is punishing them for their sexuality, right? Particularly for their childbirth, their responsibility in childbirth. No, what I'm saying is that it's interpreted according to the idea that's represented in the first Hebrew phrase. See if you can. Do you have on your text there the JPS Torah commentary or the JPS translation of the Hebrew text? No. Okay, so let's start there. Yeah, so you're going to have conflict with your husband because he's going to resist you and impose a hierarchy upon you, and the result will be that you'll have conflict with your children in rearing them, not in birthing them. And even if you look up here, I'll give you one more reference. Okay, go to the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament and look up the words that are involved in this verse, and read the commentary of the scholars who are talking about the etymology of the word. And you'll see that they argue this cannot possibly mean childbearing, that the only thing it can possibly mean is child rearing, which makes perfect sense, right? Because the relationships are broken. Okay? Now I'll give you an actual example of that, which is going to occur in the next chapter. All right? So hang on, and we'll look at the next chapter. All right. Change, of course, the Shavah tells me that the syllables are like this, which changes the word if I, depending on which vowels I put in. Okay. And I think I talk about this in the book too. And you might find the footnotes in there as well. Okay. So, but now I want to concentrate not on this, but on the piece that happens next. Because the piece that happens next is, why am I going backwards? Sorry. The piece that happens next is that when Pagnino mistranslates the idea and gives credence to the notion that men should be in charge, he changes the direction of the church and the translations from that point on. So even though we don't translate the word lust anymore, now we translate it as desire, right? And it makes us look like, and look, even some great evangelical scholars claim that at this point, God put men in charge. But that just doesn't make any sense at all based on the rest of the narrative, where God actually forgives them, clothes them in royal robes, and reestablishes their position in the world, which is what's happening at the end of the text. Okay? But, okay, so now I want to fill in one piece that isn't on the slides, and that's what happens in Genesis chapter 4, verse 1, which, wait a minute, we got one other thing to take care of, and that is how the woman gets her name. Okay? So there's a passage at the end of chapter 3 where it talks about the naming of the woman. Who provides the name for the woman? Adam, right? Not God. God uses ezer kenegdo, which is a functional term, not a naming term. Okay? So it's after all this has happened, after Adam's excuse is, well, look, I was just doing what the woman told me, and it's your fault because you designed her badly, right? After all this happens, it says, after all this happens, it says, and Adam named the woman what? Eve. But that's not possible because in Hebrew the word is Chava. How we get Eve from that is probably some relationship to a pagan ritual. But the Hebrew word is Chava. Okay? What does the word Chava mean? Now, this is interesting, right? The narrator tells us that Adam named the woman Chava, which means the mother of all living. Okay? Now I'm going to ask you something. If Chava means the mother of all living, why does the narrator have to tell me? In other words, if it's Hebrew, and I already know that it's Hebrew, why do I have to have it explained to me? I would already know that that's what it means, right? I only have to have it explained if it isn't Hebrew, and I have to be told what the meaning of the word is. In other words, I don't have to tell you angel, which means a divine being, from heaven, created by God. I don't have to tell you that, right? Because in English, you know what angel means, so I wouldn't have to explain it. Which raises a really interesting question. Why does the narrator have to explain the meaning of the word? Okay? And Nahum Sarna, in his book, his commentary on Genesis, says, yeah, this is really odd, because it isn't a Hebrew word. It comes from another, and he searches all over the place, and he finds this word on a stele. You know what a stele is? It's like a metal pole that commemorates an event in ancient times. It usually had battle stuff written in it, all kinds of stuff. And he finds the word, okay? And on that stele, the word Hava, spelled exactly the same way, means serpent. He calls his wife by the word associated with her failure. Right? In other words, what he says is, you caused me all kinds of grief, and I'm going to name you. By the way, the naming of the woman, does that remind you of anything? He names the animals. Why does he name the animals? So that he asserts authority over them. So already he is asserting authority over a woman when he was supposed to be equal with her. So the first hierarchy is inserted after the fall, when he's now blamed her for everything that's happened to him, and he names her according to her greatest failure. So from now on, he can say, serpent, get my food. Serpent, take care of the kids. Serpent, clean the house. Right? Because he's naming her according to his false assertion of a hierarchy over her. Okay? Got it? Okay? It's no different than you being nicknamed for the thing that most humiliated you. And the rest of your life, your family calls you by the nickname that you find most degrading. Because it isn't the Hebrew word. I mean, there's all kinds of words in Genesis that are borrowed from other languages. Like the word for brick in the Tower of Babel, right? The Hebrews didn't build with bricks. The word is a Mesopotamian word. Moses is an Egyptian word. Moshe is a word it's not a Hebrew word. It's not the Hebrew word for serpent. It's what language was it? Late Syriac or something. It's a word that's borrowed into Hebrew from another language, and the narrator then tells you that from now on we're going to treat this as the mother for all living, but the word itself comes from a language where it means serpent. That's really interesting. Really interesting, because remember, the text isn't written for the actors in the text. It's written for the children of Israel after they come out of Egypt. They knew other languages, of course they did. You know that okay, let me ask you this. Why, if Hebrew was originally a pictographic language, right? Paleo-Hebrew, it's pictographic. It's not like the language we see today, which is block text post-Babylonian, okay? Originally it was a pictographic language, right? It's based on the Phoenician alphabet. Why isn't it based on the Egyptian alphabet? Hieroglyphics are pictographic. Why doesn't Moses use an Egyptian-based language to write Hebrew? He knew it, obviously he knew it. He grew up in Egypt. He was educated in the royal household. Why doesn't he use Egyptian? Because a whole bunch of pictographs in Egyptian language are representations of pagan gods. So he can't use that language because he will import the idea of the pagan god into their language. So he uses a Phoenician base. Why does he use a Phoenician base? Because Phoenicians owned all the trade routes in the Mediterranean, and Egyptians were quite familiar with the Phoenician language because they were doing trade in the Phoenician language. It was like Greek in the first century, right? It's the language of trade. So, sometime go look at the ancient Phoenician alphabet and compare it to the pictographic Hebrew alphabet. And it's virtually identical. Sure, because remember what happens when Moses is picked up out of the water? And his own mother becomes his wet nurse. And what does it say? She trained him in all of the ways of thinking about the Hebrews. That's why he identifies with the people. It was until the Babylonian captivity, it was a pictographic language. We don't have that today. We have post-Babylonian block script, which is what you see in a Hebrew scroll. But before that, I mean, David wrote in pictographs. But maybe there are no years. Maybe it's not an event chronology. Maybe it's a story of identity, beginnings, and purpose. Maybe it's a tribal account, like all tribes have accounts of what their purpose in the world is, where they came from, and who they are. Maybe we've forced it into being an event chronology because we think Western, and therefore it must be a proto-scientific account. But maybe it's not. I mean, listen, there are all kinds of ancient cosmologies that all address the same kinds of issues. They just address them differently, right? Okay, I'm going to put a stop on that rabbit trail because it'll take us a long way. What I want you to recognize is what's happening in the relationship management. And for that, we need to add one more piece. And the one more piece is what happens in Genesis chapter 4, verse 1, which is the only place after the fall that Havah, the woman, says anything at all. And it's really, really important to understand what she says. Okay? In that verse, do you know what the Hebrew word et, how the Hebrew word et functions? It's aleph tov. It's found all the way through Scripture. What is it? It's a linguistic marker for a direct object. You're right. In other words, it's never translated because it just says that the next word is the direct object. I'll give you an example from the very first sentence in Scripture. Bereshit bara Elohim. Right? When God created. And then the next word is et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. But I don't translate et. I say, in the beginning, God created the heavens, even though it says et hashamayim. Because what it's telling me is hashamayim and aretz are the direct objects of the verb. Okay? So et is never translated, but it always tells me what the direct object is. Now go look at the verse in Genesis chapter 1, verse 4, or Genesis chapter 4, verse 1. And when Havah responds, but two important things happen here. The first thing is that your translation should say, the man, not Adam, because it's Ha-Adam, not the name Adam. It says, the man had relations with the wife and she became pregnant. Okay? Why is that important? Because the narrator deliberately doesn't name him. Why? Because the relationship is broken. It's not a relationship between equals anymore. And from the woman's perspective, she just needs the proper equipment to get pregnant. It doesn't matter who it is. There just happens to be only one guy around. Right? Do you understand what I'm saying? He's treating her as an animal, so she rejects identifying him as a person. It's not Adam, it's the man. Okay? And it says, and the man had a relation with her, and she became pregnant, and she said, now this is really important. She says, I have, and the Hebrew word is to barter, to negotiate. Okay? She says, I have negotiated, I have bartered, and now the word says, a yaled. Right? It's supposed to say yaled because that would mean child, but it doesn't. You know what it says? I have bartered an ish, of a man. Right? She hasn't bartered a child from God. She doesn't have a man anymore. She has a master. And she needs a man. Why? Because she hasn't stopped being the ezer kenegdo. She is hardwired to nourish, protect, sustain someone. And if her husband isn't going to allow that because he's going to treat her as a domestic slave, she will find someone else. And the someone else she finds is her child, whom she names as the man, the ish. But this is what's really crazy, because it says, et Yahweh, et Yod-Heh-Vah-He. So the grammar of the sentence tells us that God is the direct object. But that's not possible, because it's I, verb, subject, verb, have negotiated, direct object, the man, a new man, right? Except the grammar says, I, subject, verb, negotiated, the man, et Yahweh. God is the direct object of her negotiation, not the man. right? And David Foreman says, the grammar of this is all messed up. What can this possibly mean? And he suggests that in her mind, she is in a partnership with God to replace Adam. And in her mind, she is the what's the partnership you have? General partner and she is the general partner, and God is the limited partner. She uses God to get even. And by the way, she names the son Canaan, right? Not Adam. She names the son. And in pictographic Hebrew, Canaan means weapon. Weapon. Right? I mean, this is family breakdown at the highest level. Everything is coming apart. And it's one step from that to a Cain who thinks he can negotiate, barter with God, and as a result of not being able to negotiate with God, kills his brother, who he blames for not being accepted by God. I mean, the thing just gets out of control instantly, right? Okay, so why do you need to know all that? Because all of this is the background for what happens in the New Testament. All of this is the stuff that Paul works with, right? All of this is about how Paul sees what's happening in the relationship between men and women, and all of his comments which look misogynistic are really based on misinterpreting what Paul knows from the Tanakh, right? And since it's now 9:30 and I want you to have time to do these exercises, we won't talk about the New Testament text, but it's all in here. All of them, every passage is in here. And I'm just going to talk about one critical passage, Ephesians 5. Wives, submit to your husbands. Okay? Go look at the Greek text. Guess what? There's no verb in that sentence. It says, wives to your husbands. Fill in the blank. Right? It's called an ellipsis. It's a deliberate technique when you're writing Greek letters to avoid repeating things because you had to have somebody writing it all out, right? So the idea is that you take the verb from the previous sentence and apply it to this one. And the verb in the previous sentence is hupotasso, which means to put in proper order. And it's used in the following way: mutually submit one to another. And Paul just leaves the blank because he knows you already read mutual submission, right? Do you see it there? It should be in italic, in brackets. Yeah, wives to your own husbands. So the importation of the verb comes from the previous verse, which is what? Mutually submitting, right? And by the way, hupotasso is a Greek word that means to put in proper order. What is the proper order of the design plan that God put in place? Equality. Go back, right? Go back to Genesis chapter 2. Equality, right? So when you read that verse and it says, wives submit to your husbands, and you think like Pagnino that men are supposed to be in charge, you've misunderstood everything about what Paul's doing, because what he's doing is pointing you back to Genesis and saying, that's the design plan, put that in place. Okay? Yeah. Okay? And all the rest of the verses where Paul talks about what looks like women shouldn't teach, women shouldn't lead, I want women to be silent, I've addressed all those in the book. Okay? Now I want to do something really fun. And that's why you need, I mean, this is cool, right? This is cool, but it's like overwhelming. But it's not just that. The translations were self-serving. They were self-serving, right? Okay, so but here's the interesting thing.
People die on this stuff.
That's right. Here's the interesting thing. When I've had interaction with Christian pastors about this, most of them have no idea what the Old Testament actually says. Because their religion begins in Matthew, not in Genesis. So I want to drive people back to the Genesis text because, listen, Paul is a Genesis scholar. He knows what the Genesis text says. He's constantly referring to it. Remember in the argument about man is the head of woman, right? The word in there in Greek, and there's a long discussion in here in the book, the word is kephale, right? It means head, as in head of a river. Not authority, but source. right? And so Paul is referring you back to the Genesis 2 text, which says woman, man is the source of woman. There's no authority hierarchy going on here. Paul is saying, look, get back to the design plan. He points back over and over and over to the Genesis 2 text, right? But if I start my gospel with Matthew, I'll never see that. There are plenty of, there are a lot of footnotes in here, and they will tell you that there are scholars, biblical scholars, who are working on this stuff, and they understand it. But there's a big gap between what happens in the academic community and what happens in the pastorate. A huge gap. Not just about this, but about all kinds of stuff. Right? Look, I can run you through a whole bunch of books where eminent Christian scholars are now rethinking the whole idea of Paul. Right? There's a really great book by Pamela Eisenberg called Paul is Not a Christian. I mean, she teaches in a Christian seminary, right? There's Mark Nanos. There's Gaston, there's Gager, all these guys who are saying, wait a minute, we've misunderstood Paul. He's a Jewish rabbi. Let's go back and see what it means from that perspective. Right? So all this is happening, and it's been happening for the last 30. E.P. Sanders started the whole thing 50 years ago. But here's the problem. It'll take 50 more years for this academic material to sort down through the seminary so that pastors start to understand it. That's just how it works. So here's my point. This book is not for you, and it isn't for me. We are way, way past trying to make this happen. We are the products of all those years of bad teaching. Okay? This book is so that you understand what the design plan was supposed to be for your children. Because if you don't teach them what it actually says, they will repeat all the things that we misunderstood. Listen, I was teaching this in South Africa, and there was a young couple like you, right, in the back, and we're having a discussion. And she stands up and says, I don't believe this. And I said, why? She says, it's just easier for me to do whatever he says. And I'm like, yeah, because guess what? It was easier for her. She didn't want to have to struggle her way through the text. She just wanted to do whatever he told her. Right? There will always be that. The point is, you can't let your children walk down that road. Right? If you do, you will be responsible for perpetuating a mistake that you know needs to be corrected. Right? So this book isn't for you. I'm glad you're going to read it, but make sure that your kids know what this is all about. It's way too difficult for them to read if they're small children. So you're going to have to read it with them and explain what's happening so that they get it. Okay? I have a 29-year-old son. He's a great guy. He's also huge. He's 6'6", 280. Okay? He broke off a marriage that was scheduled in his life because of this. He said, Dad, I can't... And they had long discussions about this. And she came from a Christian background, and she said, listen, here's what I believe, and I've been taught this and this and this. And they went through all the texts, and he explained it to her over and over and over the course of over a year. And he finally said, this isn't going to work, because she doesn't want to be the ezer kenegdo. She doesn't want to take on that role. And he called off the marriage, and boy, it hurt him. I mean, he was really devastated. But I said to him, you're doing the right thing, Michael, because if you don't solve this before you get married, it's going to be 10 times harder to solve it afterwards. Right? This is for my kids. Okay? So, we got 25 minutes, because I'm going to go to bed at 10 o'clock. We had 25 minutes to do something really fun. Do you want to try that? I mean, listen, I'm challenging you to go read the stuff on the New Testament. If you find that, you got questions, email me. It's okay. There's all kinds of stuff on the blogs about this too, obviously, because I've been working on this for a long time, right? And it's used in marriage counseling and all kinds of stuff. So there's plenty of information out there about what's happening in the understanding the New Testament text. And there's footnotes on all of it, so you can go refer to the scholars who are working on all this stuff, okay? But I want to do something fun. And the fun thing is to try to put into practical application some of the things that we learned from the Genesis text. Right? And it amounts to 4 little exercises. And here's how it works. I'm going to give you a question, you're going to answer it. But you're not going to answer it by looking at what your spouse says. You're going to answer it without any input from your spouse. You just need a single piece of paper for each one of these. And it's a really easy exercise. It'll take you 5 minutes for each one. Okay? What? No cheating, no looking. Okay. No cheating, no looking. Because this is where we really find out if you actually understand what's happening. Okay? Here's the first question. I want you to write down the 3 most important things for your spouse, if you're a man, for what a woman would do, or what a wife would do. If you're a wife, what a husband would do. The 3 most important things in a normal marriage. In other words, you as a husband are going to list the 3 most important things that your wife must do in a normal marriage. If you're a wife, you're going to list the 3 most important things that a husband must do in a normal marriage. I'll give you an example. Here's one. Make the money. Okay? Right? That might not be on your list, but that's the idea. So write the 3 most important things that your husband should do or that your wife should do in a normal marriage. The point of the exercise is, as men write down what they expect wives to be like, and as women write down what they expect husbands to be like, they communicate words that don't mean the same thing to each other. Right? I mean, that's why I have fun playing with, is that what you meant? Because in fact, you can use the same words and mean something entirely different. Right? The only way that the design plan of transparency actually works is if you're sharing the same vocabulary. And that doesn't mean you speak the same sounds. It means that you understand the meaning of the words in the same way. Now, how's that going to happen? You have to talk about it. You have to talk about it. Right? Those things that you expect to be normally part of a marriage, you can't assume that your spouse understands them in the same way. If you do that, you will end up in Genesis chapter 3. Right? Because the whole purpose of that story is to help you understand how important it is to communicate so that you're both on the same page. Right? And look, that's hard work. Because each one of you is going to come to the marriage with a suitcase full of stuff. Right? And sometimes it's just so embarrassing to talk about what my real needs are. Because I have this Puritan idea that somehow I shouldn't just really say, you know what? Sometimes I just need you to take care of me. Right? And because I don't want to look like a pervert. I don't want to have that kind of, aura around me, so I couch it in really lovely words like love. But I don't mean the same thing that she means. Right? And then, of course, when my underlying expectations are not met, I'm frustrated because I tried to communicate to you what I want you to love me. And he says, but I am loving you. I'm doing everything I possibly can for you. And you say, yeah, but I don't feel loved. And he says, how is that possible? Everything I do is for you. I go to work for you every day. I take out the garbage. I do the dishes whenever you ask. I always tell you what a wonderful meal you make. I love you. And you say, yeah, but that's not what I need. What I need is for you to hear me. And so then he says, yeah, but I am listening. And you start telling him about how you emotionally feel. And what does he say? Yeah, but you could do this and you could do that and you could fix this and I can change that for you. And you don't want him to fix anything. You just want him to hear you. Right? So if you don't discuss all that stuff, if you haven't got that out in the open, you're working in Genesis chapter 3, where there's unspoken assumptions that are going to start interfering with the roles that you play in the marriage. Okay? Simple, huh? But very revealing. It helps you to see, my gosh, I thought my spouse was on the same page with me, but now if you look at his list and you look at the order in which he put those things, I'll pretty much guarantee you that it's not the same as yours. Right? Doesn't mean there's anything wrong with that. It means it's time to start talking about what you really expect. Because if you can't get on the same page, you are going to fall prey to the same things that we looked in Genesis chapters 2 and 3. Right? Those things will happen because it's just automatic human things. Okay? Let's try one more exercise. This is easier. if I could fix one thing in my spouse's life, what would it be? So now here's the question. What can you do to change this? And what can he do to change that? Because if that's what she really wants, you need to know you need to ask yourself, what can I do to make that happen? And if this is what you really want, you need to ask yourself. Because it's easy to say, that's your problem, you fix it. Much more difficult to say, that's my problem, because it's how I perceive you. What can I do to fix it? Since you want him to embrace the identity that God has given him, what are you going to do to make that happen? And since you want her to diminish the anger in her life, what are you going to do to make that happen, right? And it's one thing to say, you need to be less angry. It's quite another to figure out what mechanisms you will use to help.
And that's where I was.
Isn't it interesting that how we see each other and what we really want to see in the other person is often an expression of our own concerns, right? We project those and wish that the other person could be more like what we want ourselves to be. It's exactly what Adam didn't do with his wife after the fall. In other words, he went a different direction and didn't even try to understand what was happening to her, right? If you know that that's the thing that you want to see changed, it's not his responsibility to change it, it's yours. So how do you do that? Okay, I'll give you an example. Because I've done this exercise with lots of groups, right? And some really funny things happened. And there was this one young couple, and according to the man, the most important thing that he would see changed is that she would close the cupboard doors in the kitchen. Because it drove him crazy to walk into the kitchen and have all the cupboard doors open. Right, yeah. So, and she said, what the hell is the problem? I'm working in the kitchen. If I leave the doors open, it's your responsibility to come along and close them if you don't like it. Okay? Which caused nothing but tension between these people, right? Now, they loved each other. They were trying to get along, but they couldn't see how, she couldn't see how she could get him, no, he couldn't see how he could get her to close the cupboard doors, and she couldn't see why it was important, right? So let me finish the example. So here's what I suggested to them. Because they were at an impasse. I mean, this was like major roadblock in the marriage, right? So what I suggested is, if he really wanted her to close the cupboard doors and take away the animosity of, why should I have to do that? He would go into the kitchen with her, put his arm around her and say, oh my gosh, you're just such a fabulous woman. I'm so glad the way you cook is just incredible. Give her a big kiss, take her hand, and close the cupboard door, right? And every time he found a cupboard door open, he would do that. Because it's the positive reinforcement of knowing that you're so important to me, I'm not commanding you to close the cupboard doors, I'm going to be there helping you to close the cupboard doors and encouraging you and supporting you and valuing you in every step of the way, right? And by the way, it's no longer important to me that the cupboard doors get closed. What's important to me? That I give her a kiss, put my arm around her, and hold her hand while the door gets closed. Right? You think that's funny? I had one couple that argued over how you cook rice. Right? I mean, crazy kinds of things happen when we assume that the other person should know what's on our minds and act accordingly. Right? It works. And the reason that this exercise is important is because this is the design plan. Right? When you talk about naked and not ashamed and you talk about vulnerability and transparency, that means you can't run on assumptions about the other person. You can't assume that because they love me, it will mean this and this and this. You have to say, this is what I mean by emotional and financial support. Right? Do you understand this, what I'm saying? Is that what you think? Is that how you see it? Because if you don't, you'll go along thinking, like every man, but I do love her. I do this, I do this, I do this, and all the time she's thinking, I just want him to listen to me. All this stuff goes back to the design plan, doesn't it? It's all about naked and not ashamed. It's all about vulnerability, transparency, the ability to communicate. It's avoiding what happens from the opening verse of Genesis chapter 3. It's avoiding assuming that the other person will do such and such because that's what I think they should do. Right? It's really, really critical. And I can tell you something else. Your children already know. They already know all the conflict. They already know all of the disruption. They already know the changes in assumptions. They already know who's on which page. If they didn't do that, they wouldn't be so good at manipulating the two parents, would they? Right? They already know. And they don't have to actually have it written out for them. They know automatically because they share the same DNA and blood. They know what's happening. It's the emotional images, the emotional messages that communicate to children. So if you really want to know how you're doing, you ask them. Or you observe what happens in their lives. That's a real thermometer of what's happening in your lives, isn't it? Yeah. If your kids are upset, it's because something's happening with you, right? If they feel distant, it's because they reflect distance. If they feel harmony and closeness, it's because they're reflecting what's happening with you, right? As we see from Genesis chapter 4, Cain and Abel are reflections of the dysfunctionality of their parents. Absolutely. In fact, more than that, the rabbis actually say that Adam left her for 160 years. Yeah, because look, Seth is born 160 years later. So they basically say Adam said, I've had it. I'm not going to put up with you anymore. All you do is cause me misery. And he left for 160 years, sought other relationships. Of course, if we believe that the Genesis story is event chronology, we have all kinds of problems with that answer. But if it's really a story about what happens emotionally to us in destructive relationships, we don't even have to ask the question. Because it's not about who Adam went after. It's about what happened emotionally to the people that were involved in the relationship. Okay? Okay, and the last part. Back to this. Here's the problem. An ezer kenegdo will always be an ezer kenegdo. It doesn't matter how you try to control her, how you try to get her to throw most stuff out. It doesn't matter. She's going to be the ezer kenegdo because she's hardwired for it. Which means that if you're the husband and you don't allow her to be the ezer kenegdo, she will find someone else to be the ezer kenegdo for. And generally, that's the children. In other words, she takes over the role of being the nourisher, protector, provider, the chastiser, the punisher of the child. God never intended it like that. He intended her to bless her husband. But children become the replacement for that. Why? Because the husband won't allow her to be what God intended. It doesn't change her DNA. It just changes the way she exercises it. Okay? And that's Genesis chapter 4. Right? She needs a replacement man, and it becomes her child. And boy, I don't know if you've observed that, but I certainly have. When the marriage is dysfunctional, the wife puts her energy into the children. And then the husband comes home and says, how come you don't pay attention to me anymore? You're always doing stuff with the kids. And the true answer should be, I want to be your ezer kenegdo. When will you let me? Right? That dynamic is so important. Okay. My gosh, it's after 10 o'clock. All right, we're going to have to quit. It's on. Okay, so thank you very much, guys. I know it's late. You get to choose. You get to choose business as usual or go home and work on this stuff.